This week on the agenda, food security. As the number of people in extreme need nears 300 million, what can be done to tackle the global food crisis? Nearly 300 million people from across the globe are currently facing severe food insecurity. Conflict in places like Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine, as well as the rising impacts of climate change, has left the world facing a devastating struggle to feed its population. So just what needs to be done to prevent further catastrophe? Well, with me now is Dr. Bart Steenhuijsen, Senior Researcher in Food Systems at Wageningen University. Thanks for coming on the agenda. Now, look, when we talk about food security, what do we mean? Because it's not just about feeding people, it's about growing stuff, jobs, the whole food system, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. It's quite a complicated issue. It's more than only feeding people, and especially it's more than feeding just energy to people. You know, it's more about calories. It's about feeding healthy food to people. And that requires that we understand not only accessibility of food, but also how people have access to healthy food. It's about the system that delivers that food, but also how people obtain access to that food. It's about purchasing power and so on. So it's a whole system that secures people's access and availability of food. And it's more than just, the production of it, but it's also everything that creates that accessibility.
Well, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, says that in a world of plenty, children are starving to death. Just why are global hunger levels at such a critical point?
Yeah, we were pretty optimistic a decade ago, because until 2015, these poverty levels were declining worldwide, and we were thinking that we will achieve these sustainable development goals by 2030. But then after 2015, and especially since COVID, we see that these levels of poverty and undernourishment are increasing again in the world. And we come to understand that globalization has not delivered on its promises to deliver the food where it's needed, which can be explained not only by polarization, which has increased in the world, but also by conflict and the increase of displaced people, but also by the fact that the economics of food simply do not work to deliver the food where it is sometimes the most needed.
Well, you've mentioned some of these things already. Climate chaos, the cost of living crisis, combined with inadequate action, they're all playing a part, as well as conflict. I mean, how is what's happening in the likes of Gaza, Sudan and Ukraine making a bad situation worse?
For that, we need to understand that these countries heavily depend on the global markets to deliver the food that they require. These countries and these regions are not self-sufficient in the food that their populations need. So for them, the markets need to work, and in the markets, the companies that secure the food for these markets have to deliver. And especially where there is conflict, these markets don't function anymore. And what is really striking is that, especially where poverty is increasing, these people lack the purchasing power to obtain the food. And if there is no purchasing power, these companies will not deliver the food where it is needed. So conflict and lack of purchasing power together increase that level of insecurity, and therefore also food nutrition insecurity.
And of course, the extreme weather also plays a big part in terms of these growing levels of food deprivation. What's it going to take? What can we do to make food systems more resilient?
That's the right word. And resilience can be enhanced in multiple ways. It is very important that food systems do not depend on a single source, because single sources of food make people and their food systems very dependent and therefore vulnerable to shocks. So the key word is diversity. Diversity in supplies, diversity in the way people obtain their foods. And it's very important to balance between domestic supply, so a country or a food system should be able to produce the minimum and especially the products, the food that they could provide and produce with the resources available, but also complement that the foods that they cannot produce themselves with imports, but not only from one country, for example, not only wheat from Ukraine or not only wheat from Russia, because we have seen how dependent you can become on that single source. So diversifying your sources from different suppliers, be it domestic, be it international, is very, very key.
I want to talk about the impact of climate change, because food production is a big contributor to greenhouse gases. I wonder how we can change that.
Yeah, that's also very important. We have resilience, which is about reducing the risks and the impact of shocks, but then also climate change is a key contributor to those risks. And by reducing the contribution of agriculture to climate change, in the long run, we will indeed reduce climate change as such. So we must also change the way agriculture itself contributes to climate change, which is, for example, looking at animal production and the consumption patterns that have contributed to those contributions to climate change. So agriculture as such should be considered, and especially where, for example, the contribution of animal and livestock is really key to reducing CO2 and other contributions to climate change. And we need to be very much aware that food system transformations are required for that purpose.
Now, global fertilizer prices have surged faster than food prices. Higher natural gas prices have disrupted fertilizer production and exports around the world, and that's affecting supply. It's affecting costs, and it jeopardizes future harvests. Which regions do you think have been affected the most? I know that you've spent time in Africa. I mean, is that the real problem region?
Yeah, to a certain extent it is, because in Europe we also depend a lot on fertilizers, but fertilizers are used in Europe to maintain our export value of agriculture. And in that sense, if you look at what food systems contribute, it's mainly economic value. And that has another meaning than if you look at Africa, where the food system and the role of fertilizers is quite different, because in Africa, fertilizers are used to obtain a certain level of domestic production to serve food and nutrition security, and not particularly economic value as a priority. So in Africa, it's very important that fertilizers are being made available as part of the maintenance of the food system and the availability of inputs to deliver on food and nutrition security.
Now, we have new knowledge. There are satellite systems that can predict what's coming, weather patterns and that sort of thing. We've got new innovation to enhance food production and supply chains. So what needs to be done to harness all of that, to make it all more joined up and work together more effectively?
Well, personally, I'm convinced that at this moment we are producing globally enough food to feed each and everybody. It's much more distribution of that food which is key. And distribution of food is much more a question of governance, the way we govern food systems internationally, the way we treat food trade and regulate food trade across the world. is more key than introducing more technology as such. So for me, I would call for not dealing food as any other commodity, like gas or whatever, petrol, and consider it an economic commodity as such, but giving it another status, because each and everybody needs food, and therefore it needs to be considered as an essential ingredient for the well-being of people. And that needs another way of governance.
Bart de Steenhuijsen Peters, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Let's look in more detail now at just one area of conflict and the devastating impact food insecurity has on those living in a war zone. Joining me now is Tess Ingram, spokesperson for UNICEF, who's recently returned to the US from Gaza. Thanks for coming on the agenda. Now, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that 100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. So that's the first time an entire population has been so classified. Can you describe the situation?
Yeah, look, it's heartbreaking that we're at this point in the 21st century in a place where malnutrition was almost non-existent before the escalation in hostilities. So the fact that it's got this bad in such a short amount of time, I think should shock the world, particularly when there is food and aid just a few kilometres away. The situation when I was there just a few weeks ago is clearly evident as you move around, particularly when you visit hospitals. I saw a lot of people who are clearly malnourished and being treated for the condition, including children. I met one boy who had just come down from the north of Gaza, where we know that the situation is the most severe, and his grandmother was telling me that he had been eating grass for the last few days, if not weeks, because of the complete lack of access to food that they had in the north of Gaza. And of course, this is making children very sick. It's incredibly painful for them, and they're dying as a result.
Well, several aid organisations have warned that Gaza is experiencing catastrophic levels of hunger, but it's not just about the food, is it? You mentioned visiting hospitals. It's about not just about nourishing stuff like fruit and vegetables, but water, clean water, medicine, sanitation. That's all part of the story, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly right. Because all of these things are linked together, when there's a complete lack of all basic services that children and their families rely on, it creates a really deadly cycle between malnutrition, dehydration, disease. And we're seeing that in Gaza at the moment, that children aren't able to get clean water, and so they're having to drink unsafe water, which gives them diarrhea, for example. And that diarrhea, if they haven't had enough nutrition, can make them very sick and exacerbate the malnutrition that they're facing. So the combination of these things is a really deadly environment for children. And unfortunately, because the hospital systems have just been completely decimated, the ability of the healthcare system, of doctors to treat children is really compromised. I spoke to many doctors in Gaza who told me about how difficult it was for them to do their jobs and how sad they felt about the fact that they weren't able to serve children in the way that they used to and the way that they wanted to.
And you also spoke of this frustration because the aid, the food, the supplies are only a few kilometres away. And Israel says it's doing everything it can to flood Gaza with aid, including by land, by air and by sea. And there have been some slight improvements in deliveries, but food shortages in particular persist. Are we looking, do you think, at a localised or a full-blown famine?
Yeah, look, we've been saying for months now that there's a real risk of famine in Gaza, particularly in the north. And we projected at the UN community, along with global nutrition experts, that unless more aid got into the Gaza Strip in the next few months, that we would see a really even more catastrophic situation by July. So we're in that projection period now where hundreds of thousands more people were projected to go into acute food insecurity, which is incredibly serious. And it's important for us to remember that this can be prevented with aid. So far more aid can get into the Gaza Strip but particularly can get up the Gaza Strip to the north. So we have seen some food and aid get to the south and middle areas of Gaza, not enough, but very little of that aid has got to the north. And that's where we're seeing the really tragic impacts and hearing the terrible stories from people about what they're having to rely on. I mentioned the boy eating grass. I met another girl, 7 years old. Her name was Jana. She was, her mum said she was eating animal fodder because there was no food. And again, this shouldn't happen in 2024 in a place where there was agriculture and markets and food just a few months ago.
Well, I want to stay with that, actually, because Volker Turk, the UN human rights chief, says that the catastrophic hunger in Gaza was human-made and entirely preventable, which taps into what you're saying. But do you think, does that mean then that it's fixable, that it is reversible?
It is reversible, of course. You know, if we can get food in, but also nutrition treatments which children require before they can return to eating normal food when they're not malnourished. If we can get those two things in, along with clean water and medicine, we can remedy this situation. And one of the things we've been pushing for is not waiting for the official declaration of a famine before that happens. By that point, it's already too late, because at that point we have the data to say that people are dying. We shouldn't wait for that. We know that the risk is there. We know children have already begun to die because of this. And so we need to get those supplies in so that we can prevent this. It is fixable, but it has to happen fast. And unfortunately, with the ground offensive in Rafah, we're actually seeing the opposite happen. No aid or fuel has got into the Gaza Strip in about a week now, and that's catastrophic for a community that is really in this precarious situation and facing starvation.
How concerned are you, Tess, that things could get worse?
Very. I think we're seeing it unfold at the moment. We're seeing it get worse before our eyes. And I didn't think that when I was there in January that it could get worse. But when I was there in April, I saw that it was worse again. And now, even since I left a few weeks ago, the situation continues to deteriorate every single day. And one of the things we're very concerned about at the moment is the lack of fuel, because fuel runs everything. It is the lifeblood of the humanitarian response. And so without fuels, hospitals stop, bakeries stop, our trucks delivering aid stop, everything grinds to a halt. And so you can imagine that if you're a child receiving treatment for malnutrition at a stabilization center or a hospital, without fuel, your life goes back to being on the line.
Tess Ingram, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still to come here on the agenda, the problem of sogflation, how extreme weather is increasing food insecurity across Europe.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to the agenda. Climate change and extreme weather is the other main global driver of food insecurity. In the UK alone, it's been estimated that food self-sufficiency could be cut by around 10% after the wettest winter in 130 years. And that's a pattern set to be repeated across much of Europe. Joining me now are Faustine Bas-Defossez, Director for Health, Nature and Environment at the European Environmental Bureau, and Morgan Odi, a vegetable farmer from Brittany and General Coordinator of La Via Campesina, the international peasants movement. Thank you both for coming on the agenda. Faustine, let's start with you. Now, in Europe, we haven't got the kind of hunger that's found in war zones or in some developing nations. But food security affects huge swathes of households across the continent, doesn't it?
That's true. That's correct. But I'd like to first start by saying that in Europe, we don't have a food production problem. And actually, if we look at the facts, last year we had a surplus in the agri-food trade balance with record level in terms of exports. Yet in the EU, indeed, around 30 million of people are faced with severe to moderate food insecurity problem. So what we have in Europe actually is a broken food system, which is started by inequalities, but which is also pushing us outside of planetary boundaries.
Morgan, I mean, unexpected and more frequent extreme weather linked to climate change here in the UK and all over Europe has left shoppers facing higher bills. Food prices have gone right up, and it's also raised questions, hasn't it, over long-term food security. Do you also believe that there's something badly wrong with Europe's food system?
Yes, indeed, we believe in the Campesina that there is something wrong and that it's making the farming system of Europe vulnerable to the climate crisis because the regions are too much dependent on monoculture or one single production. And then when there is a bad climatic event, we don't have resilience. For example, in diverse food system and agricultural systems, if there is a problem with one crop, then the other crops might survive. But if you do only maize, for example, or only wheat, and that it is destroyed, and moreover that all the varieties are more or less the same, then you can have a big problem. So what we are defending in La Via Campesina is much more diversity. It is an agroecological food system based on diversity and based on mixity between peasant livestock and crops.
And Faustine, if we look at all of this extreme weather, you know, farmers in the UK have got waterlogged fields that they just can't harvest from. Severe drought in continental Europe, on the other hand, has decimated fruit and vegetable crops and created water shortages and much smaller harvests. How do you think that this extreme weather has undermined food production?
Yes, well, actually, climate change and biodiversity disastrous decline have become threat number one to food security in Europe, and that is clear from science. We have seen that the European Environmental Agency has published one of its first report on climate risks, a climate risk assessment, and they have clearly highlighted that, first of all, Europe is the continent that is warming the fastest in the world, and that we're not ready, and that decision makers, you know, have not done enough until now, and that we need to move much more and faster. That is clear from science. Just to give you a figure, there is in that report, you know, a reference to the storm Danielle last year, you know, in the autumn, where actually that storm and the floods afterwards have resulted in a loss of 15% of the yields, of the annual yields of Greece. So yes, climate change and biodiversity decline have really become threat number one to food security. And so far, you know, the policy toolbox, that we have in place have not helped farmers to become more resilient.
So let's talk a little bit more about what decision makers are and are not doing, Morgan, because from Berlin to Paris, from Brussels to Budapest, this year European farmers have driven their tractors to the streets in protests lasting several weeks over a number of issues around prices to environmental rules. Has anything been resolved?
Not really. The problem is in the incapacity for farmers, and in particular for small and medium-scale farmers, to make a living out of producing food for the people. And this is linked to the fact that the cost of production have been increasing a lot, while the prices at which we sell our production to the retailing sector or to the agro-industry is not increasing the same way. So it's becoming impossible to live with this increase of cost of production. So that's the reason why the main demands from the farmers were about fair prices for production and stopping free trade agreements. Because the fact that food enters from outside at very cheap prices and in competition with the European production makes it very complicated to compete. And we don't want to compete with peasants and small-scale farmers from all over the world. We believe that in every country, our job is to produce healthy food for the people. So we want food sovereignty for us in Europe, but also for the other people in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, for everybody, not competition among the peasants.
And Faustine, what do you think the issue is? Do you think it's a lack of joined-up thinking? Is it the weather? Is it conflicts in places like Ukraine? Or is it a little bit of all of those things?
Well, in a way, we can say that it is indeed a bit of all of that. But what is clear is that it is not sudden. I mean, the farmers' protests that we have seen all across Europe are the results of a broken system that has been going on for too long. Morgan was mentioning the issue of prices. Indeed, farmers, they have a very hard time making a living of their activity and also income that are indeed not fair. I mean, just to give you an example, the subsidies policy that we have in Europe now, the common agricultural policy, the way, the subsidies are being distributed, 80% of the subsidies are going to 20% of the farmers, which is deeply, deeply unfair. And indeed, there is a problem of policy coherence in that whole picture, because if we talk about agriculture, of course, we talk about consumption as well. We talk about the whole food system. And today, as Morgan was saying, we're faced with a problem of concentration of power in the value chain, where indeed some actors have a lot of power and farmers are, price taker. Eventually, they cannot set the prices, so they are suffering from very low prices, and they cannot recover the cost of production. Costs of production, which in a way are increasing and which are becoming more and more difficult in face of climate change, as we have been saying before, and biodiversity decline. But again, the tools that are there are not really, used to help farmers for the necessary transition. And maybe another thing, when I talk about broken food system, which I think is very important also in relation to what have been said before, and talking about food insecurity in the EU today, in the system, we're actually throwing away 20% of the food that we produce, which is complete nonsense.
Morgan, I wonder what needs to happen, what needs to change to help farmers become more resilient?
Well, in the EU, we've been stuck in a neoliberal dogma for now almost 40 years. And all the agricultural policies have been with the target of being competitive on international market. And this is what needs to change. Because actually the goal of farming, it's to produce food for the people. It's not to be competitive on international market. It doesn't mean that we can't trade, but it means that producing the cheapest as possible in order to be competitive should not be the goal of agricultural policy. So that needs to really change. The goal should be for farmers to be able to produce healthy food, taking care of the environment, taking care of biodiversity, emitting less greenhouse gas, and at the same time, getting a fair revenue, not only for the farmers, but also for all the people working along the food industry. Right now, in most of the European countries, the peasants, the small-scale farmers, the people working in the fields as workers, and the people working in the food industry have extremely low incomes. They are among the poor people, and sometimes the food workers and the peasants can't even afford to buy the food. So imagine, this is completely crazy. So what we are asking is a policy made based on market regulation. We need market regulation to intervene and to ensure that the prices are fair for the farmers, but are also fair for the consumers. Because also what we see is that without market regulation, you've got a huge speculation. So the retailing sectors buys very cheap to the farmers and is selling extremely expensive to the consumers. And this is creating a lot of problems.
Faustine Bas-Defossez, Morgan Audi, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, could it be time up for TikTok in the United States? We'll examine the legal battle over the world's most talked about social network. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all of the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.